This took place in 2013. After graduating college, I was about to embark on a summer-long road trip that I had been planning for over a year. At the last minute, my friends bailed on me, but being the adventurous sort, I decided not to let it stop me, so I packed up the guitar and went on my way. This is how I came to be a 26-year-old girl, road tripping it across the country alone. Since I was very poor, I was camping in national forests or rest stops, and living out of a borrowed minivan. All was going well, and I was having the time of my life. However, a few months in, I had made it to California and was traveling around the San Francisco area. One night, I was looking for a new place to camp out and found myself on a Bay Area highway, wrought with unusual detours. Because the detours were confusing and poorly marked, I found myself driving through a small town, uncertain if I was still following the detour or not. It was about 9 p.m., but since it was a small town, no one seemed to be out and about to ask for directions. I tried to use my phone, but the signal was crummy, and my phone sucked to begin with. "Figures," I mumbled, and threw my useless phone on the passenger seat. It seemed I was getting out of town, and into some warehouse district, but I could see the highway up ahead in the distance, so I decided to head towards it. The road I was on led me through rows of factories, but there was nowhere to turn off. I was still headed towards the highway, so I kept on. I passed a large old car. I don't know what kind it was, but it was one you'd call a boat. A very cool, classic car kind of thing, in the parking lot of a factory. When I passed, he switched on his headlights and pulled behind me. I honestly didn't think anything of it. I figured the poor guy was lost too, and followed me, thinking I knew where I was going. I continue on for a while, and I finally reach where the highway passes over the road. Much to my dismay, I turned a corner into a gravel lot of sorts that dead-ended into a fence. There was no way to get onto the highway. This is where it gets creepy. The gravel area was about 2 lanes wide, but the large car pulled up behind me, directly in the middle, so I couldn't get around him. This raised an immediate red flag, but I tried to convince myself that he was just lost, and that him blocking me in was an accident. However, I did not want to get out of the van and ask him to move, so I began trying to come up with a plan. I pulled a little closer to the fence, as if trying to make a U-turn. I already knew there would not be enough room, but what he did next frightened me. As the nose of my van came up against the fence, he pulled closer too, but at an angle, blocking me even more. Now I knew he was up to no good, and now I could get a look at him. He had a baseball cap and a crazy ZZ Top-style beard. To give you a picture, I was in the right of the 2 lanes, with the crazy man blocking me to the left, and to my right was 3 cement pylons running the length of the lot, with spaces between them about as wide as a car. Here's where I take a bow to the gods of dumb luck, as I saw something in those pylons that most would not. You see, prior to this road trip, I had spent 8 years as a bus driver, and much of that time was spent training new drivers. One of the maneuvers on the commercial driving test in my state was called the backwards Serpentine. To pass, you had to back the bus through 3 cones, positioned in a straight line. Since the cones are only a bus width apart, not length, you must turn at exactly the right time to master this move. And it was very similar to what I was looking at now, although doing it with cones is a little different than a cement block. Because if I crashed, I would certainly not be able to drive out of there, and who knows what this man had in mind. I gunned it in reverse, keeping the maneuver I had taught so many in my head. Keep in mind, driving tests are graded on accuracy, not speed. So this was the first time I had ever had to do this fast. By the time I had made it around the second pylon, he realized what was happening. But because he had a big car and was pushed up against the fence, it took him a few wiggles to get turned around. By then, I had completed my maneuver and took the fuck off back down the road. He followed, but there was no way to know if he was chasing me or fleeing, as there was only one way in or out of this place. I was scared because I was still lost, and presumably this man knew the area if he had picked this spot to wait for lost tourists, so I wasn't out of the woods yet. Pumped full of adrenaline, I screamed out the open window, "You picked the wrong girl to play driving games with, motherfucker." I then heard a tiny robotic voice say, "No results for driving games, motherfucker." I was confused for a minute, then remembered the useless navigator on my phone. It had been flung to the floor of the passenger side during the ordeal, and I wasn't about to stop and grab it. So I started screaming, I-80, at the top of my lungs. Finally, the phone heard me and gave me directions back to the highway. I drove around the area, stopping at gas stations to observe the other vehicles getting off at least a few times to make sure I wasn't being followed. Luckily, it was a pretty distinctive car, but I still did this for over an hour before I felt safe enough to camp out. So creepy bearded man, let's not meet. Smithfield, Rhode Island. A friend and I were fishing in an evening-friendly bass tournament, 3 to 9 p.m., Smith and Sales Reservoir. The fishing picked up as the tournament ended, so I convinced my friend to go back out for night bite. Somewhere around 11 p.m., we were fishing at the end of a peninsula, facing the shore with a dark, empty house on the land. It was very quiet, but it looked like a helicopter was landing behind the house. I gestured to my friend, but when the lights dimmed, we decided a vehicle must have come down the road and backed away. We continued fishing towards the shore in plain view of the house, when I noticed what looked like children playing with flashlights, moving frantically in one of the rooms of the house through the windows. We thought the people came home and maybe their power was out. We continued fishing, and almost immediately, although we never saw or heard anyone, there was an abnormally tall, human-shaped figure, like 7 feet tall, with a small child. The tall one looked like it was holding a flashlight, looking for frogs and such at the water's edge. The odd thing was the way they were illuminating, almost like glow-in-the-dark. But we dismissed it as the flashlight reflecting off the water back at them. Just then we noticed about 15 to 20 glowing figures, all on the shore facing us, and all different sizes. We freaked out because there was never any noise this whole time, and we were close enough to have heard people walking through the brush near shore. Just as we were about to leave, the flashlight the tall figure was holding shined directly at our boat. My partner said, "Let's get out of here." As I was starting to set the choke and pull the cord of the small outboard motor, the flashlight levitated across the water. When the motor turned over and I put it into gear, I looked up, and the light was about 8 feet above our small boat. I never looked back, and it was a short 3-minute ride back to the boat ramp. We hurried, throwing the boat in the van. Then we got inside in shock. All the dogs around the lake were going crazy, and we hadn't heard a single one the entire night. My parents and I went to our hunting cabin in Pennsylvania. My dad was getting ready to close it up for a couple months, until the next hunting season. I was allowed to walk around in the back, only to a certain point, where the lawney mode stopped and the woods began. We had over 50 acres up there, so it was a massive forest, dense and such. My dad and mom were busy up in the cabin, and I was in the back looking around, seeing if I could find any huckleberries or blackberries. I heard something. Twigs snapping or leaves crunching. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I looked up. The bushes and grass far away from me moved a little. I went back to looking down and doing what I was doing before I heard it, but it happened again. This time when I looked up, I saw the grass moving in a zigzag and getting closer. My dad had a deer stand he built, and he always kept the path to it mowed, but the rest of the area was thick brush and long grass. The grass kept moving and getting closer to the bottom of the deer stand. Soon I saw a buckskin hat and ragged, dirty red hair. The person who was standing there was close to my height. He had buckskin clothing, knee-high boots, and a knife tucked into his belt. At this point, I'm going to mention I've only told about 6 people this story, partly because it's still crazy to think about, and because it isn't something I coped with very well. Anyways, I stood there and looked at him, and he stared back at me. I don't know how long it was. It seemed like a really long time. And then he smiled. His teeth were really tiny, like jagged and maybe broken. He took a few steps toward me and started to lunge. At that exact moment, my mom or my dad slammed our van door shut, and whatever this thing was stopped, spun around, and tore through the bush. He was fast, really fast. I went back to my parents and told them. My dad looked past me at the deer stand, and he said we were done here anyway, and to get in the van. We never talked about it again, but I was petrified of the woods, unless I had more than 1 or 2 people with me. When I was a teen, I confided in a friend who was into paranormal and weird stuff like I was. He shook his head a bit. I thought he didn't believe me, but he went to his bookshelf and pulled down a book that his grandmother had given him. It had various folklore in it, really weird stuff I hadn't heard of. He flips through and spins the book around, showing me roughly what it was I saw when I was little. It looked about 95% like what I had seen. It had a name, Shanru, one I searched for, and only found something online once, using variations of how it was spelled. Basically, from the folklore he told me, it kidnapped the children of field workers. The parents had to either leave their kids alone or bring them to the fields while they were working, so they would often be walking by themselves and doing whatever they could to pass the time. The thing I saw would steal them, and according to the folklore book, steal their souls and keep them in a mine or something like that. My friend didn't know that much about it, but the fact it matched what I saw so perfectly, it made a lot of sense. I was in the woods, alone as far as it knew, and my parents were busy. It's always bothered me. For years I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was just some crazy thing a kid dreams up. But after seeing that book, it frightened the hell out of me. If anyone has any information about this thing, let me know. My cousins and I thought it would be a good idea to visit a ghost town that was located nearby. We had heard stories from other relatives, saying that they saw a woman and a daughter in a dress, standing or walking by the side of the road. Whenever they passed her, their cell phones would either die or completely lose signal, and one of my cousins said his car broke down right after passing her. 7 of us got into a big van and went to the ghost town to see if all the paranormal activity was true. We were talking and laughing in the van, making fun of those who were scared of the town, saying it was probably just their imagination. None of us had ever been there before, so we didn't know when we would arrive. As we crossed a bridge, the scenery completely changed. A huge fog appeared out of nowhere and covered the whole town and the bridge. The laughter in the van died out. We parked on a dirt road, on the outskirts of the town. We killed the engine and rolled up the windows. We just sat there, looking into the dark, empty houses. It felt as if they were full of ghosts, and that they were watching us, as if we had invaded their space. The atmosphere was so tense, and after 5 minutes of sitting there in the dark, the driver suddenly turned on the van and drove away. We all wondered why he left so suddenly, and we asked him, but he wouldn't answer us. He parked at a nearby gas station, and his face was extremely pale. He finally started talking, and said that he saw a little girl walking behind one of the houses, coming towards the van. He was so scared. In fact, he was still shaking. We went inside the gas station, and the cashier saw his pale face and asked if we had just come back from the ghost town. We told him that we did, and that our driver supposedly saw a little girl. The cashier then told us that he'd seen her too. He said that if we wanted to experience something really crazy, we should wash the car and go back. So we did. We washed it from top to bottom and dried it with paper towels. We agreed to switch drivers and headed back, but this time we drove into the center of the town and stopped. We sat in the van for 15 minutes, just looking out for signs of a girl or signs of activity in the houses. I can't even explain how tense the atmosphere was. There were 7 of us, all over 17 in the van, and we had to hold hands. It was weird, but everyone was so scared we couldn't help it. A few minutes later, I began to see a figure in the distance. It seemed like the little girl everyone was talking about. But something was odd. It didn't look like the girl was walking. She was making these weird movements, as if she was limping or something. I told everyone to look, and they said they saw her too. We watched her, and after a few seconds, the figure stood straight up. Right when she did, she disappeared into the blackness, and a loud bang hit the driver's side. The gravel beneath the van made sounds, as if someone was crawling under the car, and then we felt thumping under our feet. Then there were thumps all around us, the back window, the sides. We got the hell out of there. We went back to the gas station. Everyone got out, and we all saw it. On the driver's side mirror was a fresh handprint. I made my way to the back of the van, and there was a little footprint on the back bumper, along with a set of handprints on the back window. We were all freaked out. We took some paper towels and tried to wipe the prints away, but they just wouldn't come off. They didn't feel wet or anything, but they looked as if they were. Everyone was scared to get back in the van, but eventually we did, making sure not to drive the van directly to someone's house, because in our culture, something could have clung onto the van and followed us home. So we went to a nearby Walmart. We stayed in the store for about 45 minutes, but when we came out, the prints were still on the van. We called someone to pick us up and went back to get the van the next day. The prints eventually disappeared, and we drove it back to my cousin's house. I'm never going back to that ghost town again. About 3 years ago, I moved into my first apartment. I lived alone on the first floor of a 3-story shotgun house, built in the mid-1800s. The house was beautiful, albeit a little creepy due to its age. It was on the nicer end of a rough neighborhood near the university I was attending at the time, and break-ins were pretty common. But I always felt safe, because my landlord and his wife lived in the 2 floors above me. They were in their late 60s, but it felt good to know I wasn't totally alone. It was the first fall I was living there, and the days were getting shorter. On this particular evening, it was already good and dark outside by 6 p.m. I was in the kitchen making dinner, when suddenly the power cut out. I was a little startled, but luckily the flame from the gas range was still going. so I could see well enough to grab my phone and use it as a flashlight. Aside from the flame flickering under the pot of soup, the house was pitch dark. I double-checked the light switch in the kitchen, but got nothing. The only thought that occurred to me was that it was a strange time for the power to go out. It wasn't storming, and it wasn't particularly hot outside or anything. I used the light from my phone to navigate from the kitchen toward the front of the house. I peeked out the blinds in the living room, but couldn't see from that vantage point whether any of the other houses had lights on. I decided it would be a good time to call the landlord, because I sure as hell wasn't going down to our creepy stone basement to mess with a 100-year-old fuse box. I knew they were home, since I kept hearing them go up and down their steps earlier, so I rang them up. Being older folks, they only had a house phone, and when I called, it was disconnected. Of course, it was connected to the power. Still standing there in the pitch darkness, I wasn't quite sure what to do. I remembered the burner I left on and was headed back toward the kitchen when I heard their front door slam shut and heavy footsteps in the entryway that separated our apartments. Then I heard two men's muffled voices. You know that primal fear people talk about when something bad is about to happen to them? I felt it. Every hair on my body stood up. In half an instant, my heart was in my throat. I stood, paralyzed in the doorway to the kitchen. Luckily, I snapped myself out of it and grabbed the closest weapon I could find, a bright pink chef's knife on the kitchen counter. I'm a small woman and certainly not strong. I had my doubts about whether I could fend off one intruder, but two? I crept as quietly as possible back toward the front door, clutching the knife in one hand and my phone in the other. I stood a couple feet from my door, and the men were still out in the entryway, talking. Their voices were rough-sounding, and definitely not from the area.
"Well, do what you gotta do. I'll be waiting in the van,"
said one. With that, I heard the front door open and close. At this point, my heart was beating out of my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Were they just breaking in, or did they intend to hurt me? Had they already hurt the landlord and his wife? I made my way over to the blinds and peeked out the window again. Sure enough, I saw a man in dark clothes hop into a white van parked across the street, just to the left. I live at the end of a dead-end street, where you can only park facing one direction, and the van was facing the wrong way. I tried to collect myself. There was nowhere to hide, really. Perhaps I stood a chance if this guy wasn't expecting me to be ready when he came in. Unfortunately, my cat hates strangers, and she was now going crazy, tearing back and forth through the house at full speed, meowing. In my head, I silently cursed her for giving our position away, and probably killing us. Then, suddenly, I heard the landlord's apartment door open and close again, and the man went back upstairs. A million thoughts raced through my mind. My car was parked just up the street. If I sprinted, I could make it and drive somewhere safe. I don't know why I didn't just call the police. So there I was, with my hand on the doorknob, psyching myself up to run. I couldn't hear the man moving around anymore, which probably meant he was on the 3rd floor. His buddy was still waiting in the van, lights off. I peeked one last time to make sure no one was waiting near the front stoop, before I ripped the door open and ran full speed out the entryway and up the sidewalk about 100 feet to my car. I hopped in and locked the doors, when suddenly my phone started vibrating in my hand. It startled me so badly, I almost chucked it across the car. I answered. "Hello?" It was my landlord, sounding as calm as ever. I said something along the lines of, "Are you okay?" But I was so scared and out of breath that it pretty much came out as gibberish. He seemed confused. He started telling me that, yes, they were fine, and the power was out on the whole street. He had just phoned the energy company on his new cell phone to check on it. And he hoped I didn't mind, but some repairmen were at the house to check on the heating and cooling system, and they might need access through my apartment to get to the basement. Slowly, the dust began to settle in my mind. I had been at the point of maybe having a heart attack, and definitely wetting myself over some repairmen, one of whom was still waiting outside in the van, and had just seen me haul ass up the street with a giant knife in my hand. I was too embarrassed to walk back to the apartment, so I just told the landlord to go ahead and let them in if he needed to. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story, or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. So what's up, man? What do you want to do? Should we go get something to eat?
Sure.
I heard about this place where this guy cooks with electricity. Supposedly he's a badass, and there's rumors that he's from another realm.
Let's do it.
There he is.
What the hell is he doing?
I think he's tenderizing the meat. Here he goes. Wow, it looks really good.
Alrighty, can I get you guys anything else tonight?
No thanks. Toasty!
Já, snemma, bergsbus, hrish.
And so say sure. Hold on, wait for her to stop. I understand though, dude. Are you gonna get pissed when I put that at the end?
Flawless victory.
Hey, I noticed that Coke looks a little low. You need something else?
Fatality.